Brief introduction, if that's okay. My name's Chase Adams. I'm the Director of Organizational Development at Hannah Resource Group. We have been doing this learning collaborative for the last, I don't know, 6 or so months now, um, all in the spirit of best places to work in Kentucky and different topics and that make organizations best places to work. So all the fun things that we have to kind of consider and keep in mind as we're trying to design and support our work environments for our employees. So this month's topic is on generational differences within the workforce. And It's a timely topic. I'll be honest. I've had a lot of requests to talk about this the last, I don't know, 18 months to 24 months or so. But it is actually something that's a part of the Best Places to Work survey process. So thought it would be good to kind of give you guys some just information. Hopefully this will be fun too. Like I think this is kind of fun topic to talk about. It's interesting. And like I said, it is tied into the Best Places to Work survey process. So the reason that Best Places even asks for the generational demographic data of the survey participants is, it's for a couple different reasons. But when the person self-selects what generation they belong to on the survey, it really does help you as an organization understand just the diverse needs and preferences based on someone's belonging to a particular generation in your employee demographics. Because each generation does have unique values and communication styles, and it's good to just to see what their priorities are. And obviously you can compare the data year over year, which is part of the benefit of being a part of the surveying process. But also, I think a lot of the insights that we derive from the results of just the demographic preferences on survey, both in the quantitative and the qualitative data sections, you can really take that feedback and kind of hopefully tailor policies and engagement strategies to the different demographics, excuse me, and preferences that they may have. And that can be anything from how you design your benefits program to, if you want to create some kind of mentorship initiative, or you want to update some sort of communication modality that's going to appeal to a certain demographic, that's another, kind of strategy. And then at the end of the day, the other thing is just it's supporting this multi-generational culture that you're trying to build with everybody's different, kind of preferences and takes kind of included, and hopefully cultivate this high trust environment that aligns more with with Best Place to Work and the goal of creating cultures where everyone, regardless of their age, can thrive. So that's just kind of the preface of why do they actually track generational demographic data on surveys. It's your business case, right? So let me start with my first slide here. And oh, hold on. Sorry. Share sound. Sorry, I have a couple of video clips, so I had to share the sound real quick. Sorry. And I want to let's see here. Sorry guys. Wasn't expecting that. Okay, share sound is on.
Chase, you're doing something really cool with your video. I like your image has been moved onto the slide deck and
Yeah,
back. I don't know how you're doing that.
I'm trying to stop that though, and I'm trying to get where my notes are. My slide note is. I'm trying to change the layout too, real quick. Sorry guys, it was working fine a second ago. Let me see if I can escape out of here. It's like when I turned that sound on, no, I don't want to do that. I want to. Hold on, guys. I'm sorry. I swear this worked just fine. Okay, I want to share. Okay, Can you see the slides, or do you see like a layout format here?
We see the slides.
Okay, great. Now, does the layout have my notes though?
I don't
Uh,
see your notes.
okay.
Mm-mm.
Okay, you just see the slides, right?
Just see the slides. Yep.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for
No problem, Chase.
that. Sorry, guys, a little bit of a tech problem here. All right, so as we jump into today's general conversation, I just want to set the stage, kind of like why we're talking about this within like the sociological construct. So we're within generations in sociology, we're kind of examining patterns and relationships, but also institutions and how these all influence individual behavior and our society's development as a whole. So, we're not looking at specific people, but rather the societal norms of how groups of people interact with each other, specifically within the workplace. So, I always kind of my disclaimer for all my generational content that I've ever done is these are not all-inclusive descriptions of any one person, but rather trends that we see across millions of people and culture. It does not mean that every single person and generation may think the same way, act the same way, or values the same things. So generations, I say, are kind of like horoscopes, right? They can give us insight into influences and patterns, but they're not destiny, and they certainly are not a box we put people in. So we're focused on trends, not traits. But in the work, in our work environment, I think we see questions about morality and social expectations kind of come head to head within the workplace because things like inclusion and productivity and technology and even parenting styles, they kind of show up in these really potent ways within the workplace. So it's really important that we see how generations come together in the workplace to create this better future, this more inclusive and productive and hopefully better engaged workforce. So just wanted to kind of start with Kim Lear too. She is kind of a figurehead within kind of the generational topic out there. She's got a degree in sociology, but she always says it's not about out with the old and in with the new. Every generation brings in great value to the workplace, and it's up to visionary leaders to leverage the unique opportunity we have to mesh 5 generations. And that is kind of our current state. We have 5 different generations working right now. Gen Alpha is just starting to, become teenagers and maybe have these part-time jobs in service sectors and things like that. But within the next couple of years, we're going to have, 18 to 20-year-olds that are working full-time that are going to be in Gen Alpha. So we'll have 5 generations working simultaneously. But I do want to start with something kind of fun, and just anybody in the group, unmute yourself, answer the question if you'd like. So I want to start with this description of a generation as so it's lazy, spoiled, idealistic, inflated sense of self-importance, and a deep need for admiration. Would anybody like to take a guess to see what generation these attributes have been uh, uh, I guess assigned or used in the past to describe?
I'll guess. I don't know if I'm right, but I'm thinking millennials.
Millennials. Okay, that's a pretty good guess. Anybody else?
Whichever generation the current generation is.
Whatever one's the current generation. Okay, that's a good guess too. Anybody else before I give you the answer? All right, I'll go ahead and spoil it. So it's actually, Tom Wolfe said this about boomers that were entering the workforce in the mid-70s. And Tom Wolfe is the culture writer and critic that actually came up with the me generation as the kind of the overarching descriptor of the baby boomers. But he actually said this in August of 76 about boomers that were in their 20s and were entering the workforce. He also described them as narcissistic with a self-inflated sense of self-importance, a deep need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others, and also ascribing to a higher importance to social responsibility, which is funny because you hear that about millennials, which are typically their children, later. So the reason I always throw this in here is we have a great American tradition, or societal, I guess, global tradition of kind of dumping on the most recent or the youngest generation that enters the workforce, right? So every generation believes that they work harder than the generation that came before them, that the next generation's softer or less prepared than they were, that their work ethic and values are superior to the ones that follow, and that they want meaningful work and opportunities to make an impact. But these are all common threads that connect all these generations much more than they divide. So when we feel tension between generations, it's often not because people don't care. It's because they care differently and based on what they were taught matters to them. So let's start with generations and just various statistics, things to be aware of. So I'm going to talk about the four major ones that are working currently that are adult age and probably are working full time. Like I said, Gen Alpha is the fifth and is entering, maybe depending upon how old they are. But in general, baby boomers are roughly 1946 to 64. They represent 20 million within the U.S. workforce right now. Gen X is 65 to 79. They represent roughly 55 million. We got millennials from 80 to 95. They represent 70 million of the current working population. And then Gen Z, our youngest cohort, 1996 to roughly 2010. And then after 2010, we enter into Gen Alpha, which we're just entering, and we have kind of limited data and trend information on. I do have a slide at the very end that kind of is what they think they're going to want, so I'll give you that too. You sit between them, and obviously you feel like you don't belong wholly in one or the other, right? But I think that those people that are on the cusp actually see both perspectives or both sides of the generations that they may fall between. So they actually can be the best translators within the workplace, because I kind of consider them generationally bilingual, right? They kind of see both sides. But what shapes a generation, right? So major historical events, economic conditions, parenting styles, technology developments or shifts, and then popular culture, media, things that we consume, right? But generations aren't random. They're shaped by what was happening during people's formative years. So teenage years into early adulthood. And that's, of course, when people develop independent thought and they start to realize that they're different than their parents. And they try to form an identity that's wholly, unique or different than their predecessors, right? So think about it. If you grew up during a recession, you may be more cautious about money. If you grew up during a tech boom, you might assume instant access to information is very normal. And if you came of age during a period of like national trauma or war, you may value things like security or stability more deeply. So just all these things that are kind of shaping and forming these generations. But let's start with baby boomers. So they were born roughly between 46 and 64. So they were raised during a time of optimism, national pride, and a lot of expansion, actually massive expansion. Think about television was the newest technology that exploded onto the scene. The first man walked on the moon, and civil rights were fought and expanded. So many baby boomers came into the job market in a bull market with the strength of the U.S. economy behind them, and an increased population supported them into kind of bringing about this true change across the country. So most generations before them had fought hard for things like social justice, knowing that they would never see change within their own lives, but that their kids would live a better life. And boomers actually got to see some of that change happen in real time. They actually got to see the kind of the final, not the final form, but they got to see the results of some of those fights, right? And because of increased population, those born in the mid to late part of the boomer era experienced some degree of scarcity. So there wasn't enough gas for everyone during the oil embargo in the 70s, for example, or they got to school and there weren't enough desks for everybody or enough textbooks. And then some of them, when they got into the job market, there weren't enough jobs for everybody. So they learned to stay employed they learned that they needed to stay employed, so you have to give 110%. You had to arrive 5 minutes before your boss and leave 5 minutes after, because if you didn't, there'd be somebody else right behind you that's willing to take your place. So at work, boomers were taught to stay loyal, climb the ladder, prove yourself. Titles, things like corner offices recognition, those are all markers of quote unquote success. Boomers also created the 80-hour work week, which, the rest of generations, I'm sure, are super thankful for now, right? But, it was of the era, right? So boomers bring that spirit of dedication and loyalty, to the organization and to the roles and to really every room they're in. But I thought this was kind of fun too, to kind of, for each generation, use reference one song that probably encapsulates them as a generation. So I thought like Born to Run was a good one for the boomers, because it's all about freedom and risk and chasing dreams, or Respect, because it demanded dignity and equality. And those were, they weren't just music, they were really about like movements that were going on within society. So I also, we have enough time? I think we do. Okay, these are short. I also try to pull in like one pop culture advertisement for each generation that kind of, I think, encapsulates kind of where they're coming for, their perspective. So this is the Coca-Cola commercial, the Hilltop Coca-Cola commercial, and it's all about unity. And can you hear it? Can you hear it? Okay. So anyway, I think it kind of is the idealized version of boomer culture, right? It was the unity, it was the togetherness, it was the dismantling of prior social norms around race and gender and all those fun things. And so I think this is a good advertisement that kind of represents boomers. And obviously, Coke did a great job with that. It's a very famous commercial. I don't know if you guys watched Mad Men, but that was how it ended. Which I don't know if we were supposed to then assume that Don was the creator of the Coca-Cola advertisement, or yeah, anyway, kind of left ambiguous. But anyway, so baby boomers again were shaped by the post World War II economic boom, the civil rights movement, the space race, Vietnam War and protests, and the rise of television. So in the workplace, they're loyal to their employers, but they value things like face-to-face communication, and they're motivated more so by prestige, promotions, and legacy, and they believe in paying your dues. So they tend to be extremely mission driven. They're willing to work the overtime. They're comfortable with hierarchical kind of organizational structure, but they're often deeply committed to legacy. So they're all about reliability, right? They're going to show up early. They're going to still read the manual, and they're going to take great pride in doing the job right the first time. So if you're leading or working with boomers, here's what builds their trust: respect their experience, because they've been in this game for a long time, and it's great to acknowledge that. To use face-to-face conversations or phone conversations when possible. Emails and Slack can still feel a little impersonal or maybe abrupt to someone that may be a boomer. Be clear about the why. Boomers don't resist change, but they certainly want to know what the change that may be occurring in your organization is thoughtful and necessary. And don't forget a thank you. I think that they're, as a generation, very much still about the recognition, and a handwritten note of thanks is gold, for them. But they value things like clarity, commitment, professionalism, and if you give them that, they'll do anything you want, basically. But they really thrive in roles where they can exercise their institutional knowledge, and that's seen as a vital thing within the role. Maybe in a role where mentorship could be encouraged, and roles that are more stably and consistently rewarded. But that's oftentimes some opportunities to put them into special projects, onboarding new staff, serving on committees where experience matters. So if your organization has a critical but chaotic project, I'd put a boomer on it. They'll make sure that not anything really falls through the cracks. So, any questions about boomers? Does it feel like if you belong to this generation, do you agree with what I'm saying? Because I'm going to move on to Generation X. They're the middle child generation. There's less of them between boomers and millennials. They get kind of forgotten about or overlooked, which is unfortunate because there's so many good Gen X people right now that are probably primed for leadership roles and have the experience. They just haven't had the opportunity yet to kind of flex those muscles. And I see that a lot in organizational design challenges right now. We have a lot of people that are living much longer, healthier lives, and they're working longer, which is great. But that means that some of these roles aren't being vacated fast enough for people like Gen X and maybe some elder millennials that are maybe ready for a leadership role, but there's literally just not a seat for them because we have people still working. But let's talk about Generation X. So they were born roughly between 65 and 79, but they were shaped more so by a world that was a little bit less reliable. So they entered the world hearing one president say, "I'm not a crook," and then they reached adulthood or college age, and they heard another president say, well, something else about things that may have occurred within the Oval Office, right? So their formative years were bracketed by 24/7 media, a lot of unhinged advertising, and a lot of public betrayal. So they were the first generation to grow up with a lot of divorce rates, where both parents worked, and there wasn't a stay-at-home parent. The invention of the personal computer, Watergate, and government mistrust, MTV, and a total shift of how youth culture was marketed to. And I am young enough where I do remember when MTV played music videos before they turned into like 24/7 reality television. But they're oftentimes called the latchkey generation because many came home to an empty house, made their own snack, they did their own homework, and they really had to learn how to figure things out on their own. So this is also the generation that was raised on 24/7 media. So, CNN launched in 1980. MTV launched in 1981. And so, those were things where you weren't reading or hearing the media. You were visualizing it, right? So you weren't hearing music, you were watching videos, and you weren't reading the headline on the New York Times. You were watching a broadcaster talk about the news happening in real time, 24/7. So they were the first to be marketed to heavily as teens too. So you had like campaigns like Pepsi Generation and Nike and Levi's. Saturday morning cartoons and sitcom. A lot of it was very sardonic and independent, and there was a lot of irony in the media that they consumed. And then think about the music genres that kind of sprung up during this time too of Gen X coming into their adulthood. You had things like grunge and hip hop, which were really rooted in disillusionment and rebellion. Sorry, I got all excited about grunge and hip hop because I wanted to make my Nirvana reference here in a second, and then I forgot what my next point was. But think about too, like the way people were advertised to. There was very little regulation, right? So this was kind of the wild west of media marketing, where ads were emotional, manipulative, and oftentimes misleading. So if any Gen Xers remember Joe Camel at the Camel cigarettes, they created a cartoon mascot that was actually intended on selling cigarettes to children and young teenagers. And, that would not happen now, right? It's quite the opposite. I mean, it still happens, I think, in food in particular, the way they market like, sugary cereals to children. But, by the early 90s, studies found that Joe Camel was as recognizable to kids as Mickey Mouse, which is, if that doesn't say something about culture, I don't know what does. But anyway, Gen X girls were also marketed things like Slim Fast and diet pills and beach body products from 10 plus, 11 plus years of age. Beauty ideals were often unattainable, and they were paired with airbrushed photos, a heavy peer pressure, and zero regulation. Gen X also, funny enough, lived through the Ford Pinto recall, which was, it was kind of a known thing that Ford Pintos would explode if they had rear impact. And Ford only recalled them after there was a large public outcry. So trust in brands and legacy things were fragile at best, let's say, for Gen Xers. They learned that authority doesn't always matter. It's integrity that matters most. Leaders fall, and sometimes you better have a backup plan. Systems like the government, education, corporate life all kind of work against the individual. They grew up with AIDS, the Challenger explosion, crack epidemic, the war on drugs, none of which were solved by the institutions that Gen X was told to trust. And Gen X became skeptical but savvy, and independent but loyal to those who've earned it, quietly competent but oftentimes cynical and always questioning the hype. And then the song that I chose to kind of represent Gen X is probably "Smells Like Teen Spirit" by Nirvana, right? So it's all about disillusionment and authenticity. But they also grew up watching their parents lose pensions, presidents lose credibility, and institutions lose integrity, and they still show up to work ready to lead. They just don't need you to clap for them while they do it. They don't want a gold star, they just want the truth. So again, shaped by distrust in the government, rising divorce rates, latchkey independence, MTV, punk grunge, hip hop shaped teen identity, age crisis and just say no, personal computers, floppy disks, and pre-internet technology, Challenger explosion, and the fear of the Cold War probably also played a role in how they were shaped. In their workforce, in the workplace, they prioritize being independent, resourceful, and skeptical of top-down authority. They thrive with a lot of autonomy and minimal supervision. They're a little bit more resistant to hype. They value competence over charisma, and they oftentimes are the generation that can bridge that analog and the digital, because a lot of them had analog childhoods and early teens, and as they were coming into their 20s and probably entering the workforce, they had more of a digital adulthood. So today's Gen Xers are often, really competent directors, project leaders, and manager of managers. But they're also balancing things like aging parents and teenagers. And honestly, a lot of them are holding the organization together, but they're doing it quietly. So they tend to lead with logic, be low maintenance, but high output, spot organizational dysfunction quite quickly. And they may say what everybody else is thinking, but they won't say it in the meeting. They say it in the meeting after the meeting. They don't love drama. They don't want flash. They just want competence. So if you're communicating with the Gen X or trying to lead or collaborate with them, don't lie to them. They grew up with lack of trust and truth. So if you lie once and they find out, you'll probably never regain their trust again. Don't waste their time. They like efficiency. Don't sugarcoat it. They like realness, even if it may be a little messy. Don't micromanage them because, again, they're hyper independent. Just set the goal and then let them go. Humor goes a long way. They like a lot of self-deprecation. I think it goes back to those Saturday morning cartoons. If you try too hard to impress them, they kind of smile that phoniness a mile away. So they respect people who do the work and know their stuff, and where they thrive are in roles where they have the space to lead without being watched, strategy that meets execution, and systems that need fixing or reinventing. So they're really great middle upper managers right now, really great cross-functional leaders. They're great in a crisis, and they're actually quite good change management players. So if you've got a fire to put out or a system that's breaking down, you need to change it, I would say give it to an X. Gen X person, they'll roll up their sleeves, they cut out the noise, and they quietly make it work again. Here is an advertisement from the Super Bowl. It's the early 90s. That's marketed to Gen Xers that were entering the workforce. This is just, again, kind of fun, so you can kind of see what kind of media people were consuming and then, of course, absorbing. Now we understand why they're so angsty and cynical, right? So let's move on to millennials. We were born roughly between 1980 and 1995. So, explosion of technology in our youth. And, kind of formed by rapid expansion, but not a lot of regulation in that realm either, right? So if you remember things like Napster or LimeWire, We were downloading music legally. And then when people said, we don't like that you're stealing our music, we're going to charge you for it. We were like, how dare you? This is my right. Right. I can burn as many CDs as I want to. And then infect my parents' computer with horrible viruses. This generation, our generation, I should say, are shaped by a world that was moving fast, but a lot of things kind of were breaking. This generation was typically raised by baby boomers, but some elder Gen Xers also. But those parents kind of taught millennials to believe in possibility. So they were told by their boomer parents that they could change the world. We grew up with color-coded school planners, group projects, and motivational posters that said things like "teamwork makes the dream work." We were taught a lot of emotional intelligence, empathy, and the importance of speaking up. A lot of us, though, entered the workforce during the Great Recession. So we've had to kind of rebuild our careers several times over, oftentimes, though, through creativity, things like side hustles, or just a relentless belief that, work should mean something and eventually we're going to achieve that or obtain that meaning. I don't think millennials are necessarily entitled. I think that they are expecting work to deliver what they were told was possible. So offering some sort of purpose, flexibility, development, opportunity, and impact. And there's two major themes for millennials, I think, that I wanted to kind of mention today. Is that the creation of and boom of social media, and that really shaped kind of our youth and our early adulthood, but also how violence was experienced. So millennials and were in middle school or in high school when 9/11 happened, and teachers rolled TV carts, on into the room so we could watch the second plane hit the second World Trade Tower. And then, of course, we had Columbine, in 1999, where, it was just 24/7 loops of, kids that had been shot, and it was just horrible, right? So for many, I think, and especially millennials, I think that like the childhood innocence kind of fell apart in those few years, right? But because of this violence, I think the response, especially for parents at the time, were that they were then going to give us safety and structure, right, and opportunity. So that's kind of where that helicopter parenting kind of style got maybe ascribed or described as a millennial, the way millennials were being raised. But we had a lot of tight schedules. We had a lot of check-ins. We were super involved with 1,000 different things. And it came with a lot of supervision. So after Columbine, and the way the school shootings that have since followed, vigilance was even more, top of mind, I guess. We had lockdown drills that replaced fire drills, and doors were locked, and parents weren't just engaged. I think they were hyper conscious and hyper aware of the dangers of the world. So, they held their kids a little bit tighter, right? Than maybe they had before. And then the rise of technology, of course, really influenced millennial culture. So we were really the first generation to come of age within the online world, but it was very Wild West. So, we were raised during the birth of the internet. It wasn't sleek. It wasn't the curated version we have today. And I'm an elder millennial, so I still can't really explain how the internet works and what it is and how it works. I just know that I'm online. So yeah, we're still talking dial-up connections though, AOL chat rooms, and your first friend named Tom, and websites that were built on things like GeoCities with neon fonts and dancing GIFs or GIFs. There were no real digital boundaries, right? The only parental control is when your mom maybe picked up on the landline and it interrupted your connection. There were no privacy warnings. No, do you accept the cookies, banners that you get now. If it was on the internet, it had to be true, right? This was the era of sharing personal info with strangers because someone said that they were also 14, female, and from, Illinois, or clicking on a chain email so that your crush wouldn't hate you forever. But millennials grew up building identities online, and long before people really understood what that meant. So they learned how to self-brand before the term existed, that the content is public, permanent, and often performative, that information is everywhere, but truth is hard to verify, and that sometimes the internet isn't a resource, it's a risk. So they didn't scroll, they searched, and they didn't go viral. They made sure that their top 8 on MySpace friends was up to date. But they came of age in a world where technology was both magic, but also a minefield. So they learned to self-brand even before that had a name. But millennials were the first generation that was raised with internet in their homes, Google in their pockets, and social media that shaped their relationships, identities, and careers. And they watched, some of their favorite influencers online go from their bedroom to a boardroom that were creating $1 million brands. And millennials were also the first generation that were raised to collaborate from day one. So in elementary school, the desks weren't lined up in rows as much anymore. They were grouped into pods. I don't know about you all, but I grew up with we had grades 1 through 3 were kind of like in a shared area. Like you were in different grades, but you kind of had like a core group of multiple grades kind of mixed together. But we were taught things like use your words, work it out together. We had things like guidance counselors and emotional check-ins and things like that were way more common in schools. We're also the generation that really came of age during that testing culture, like the No Child Left Behind. They standardized tests, and data was everything, right? We were constantly measured up against a kind of a standard expectation. But in the workplace, we entered the market when the recession was kind of at its height. A lot of us that were older, but entire industries had collapsed, and the promise of going to college, getting a job, and building a good life kind of stopped holding up. So we also saw things like our parents get laid off from jobs that they had held for decades, and they decided maybe loyalty should go both ways. And millennials were told to share their feelings, work in groups, and trust their teachers. And they still watched things happen to those same people on the news. They were raised to dream big, but graduated into an economy that had crashed hard. They believed in fairness and hard work and still got laid off in their first year. I don't think that's necessarily entitlement like it's been described before. I think it's disillusionment. And I think as a generation, millennials have been trying to build something kind of real ever since. And then the millennial ad is too long. We only have 20 minutes, so I'm gonna skip the ad for this generation. But it's a Google ad from the early 2010s. I think it's like 2010 or 2011. And basically, the girl is like FaceTiming. What would have been FaceTime then using Google to connect with her boomer parents while she's in college. And then she's also using Google as like a search engine to like deal with a bad breakup, or how do I tell my parents that I'm going to change my major. So she's using the internet kind of as a way to navigate life, right? Both using the internet as a resource or a point of authority or whatever to try to give her guidance in life, but then she's also using her parents, but she's video chatting with them. I'm not going to play it though, because like I said, it's a little long and it's a little emotional because it's kind of sad too. But anyway, if you want to watch on YouTube sometime, please do. So millennials, again, 80 to 85, 95, sorry. But in the workplace, they really want meaningful work, not just the paycheck. They do expect feedback and development opportunities. They're collaborative oftentimes by default, obviously more comfortable with technology tools and hybrid work setups. They value things like flexibility, work-life integration, and mental health. And they're loyal to leaders who invest in them, not just to titles or organizations. So I also think that millennials can also, just like Gen X, help bridge the gap between analog and digital, or hierarchy and networks, or structure and innovation, because they kind of have a foot in both worlds based on how they were raised. There's also been more research on what millennials value in the workplace than any generation prior. So some of this all comes from like things like SHRM and Gallup and Deloitte that has studied a lot of published studies on the values of millennials in the workforce. So I'm going to give high level really quickly. So purpose-driven work. They want their jobs to mean something, and hopefully their values align with something that the organization or the role is offering them. So if it's a social impact, if it's community, if it's sustainability, something like that. It's not just a paycheck. Remember, it has to matter. Continuous learning and development. They expect more than just their onboarding packet and an annual review. They want some sort of mentorship or growth opportunity. They want clear growth paths too. So I think we kind of talked about things like succession planning or career pathing here before, but kind of that growth path is really important to them. Development is your biggest retention strategy for a millennial. So if I'm not growing, I'm going, right? And then feedback and communication. So frequency and real-time feedback, not just a once-a-year performance review. They're not being needy, but I think millennials we were raised more in a classroom or in an environment that really encouraged, reflection and group work and feedback and all that stuff. So that's kind of how we show up to work, right? Also flexibility and autonomy. So I think, obviously pandemic was a huge shift in how we work. But even before then, millennials had kind of started to dip their toe into the remote flex work life integration areas. It's just that we had a kind of cataclysmic event that really made those things more possible or feasible or palatable or however you want to say it. So continue that, right? But they want to get the job done. So I'd say that millennials more so want freedom to do it on their terms when it's possible. I think a good way to describe it is like they'll work hard, just want somebody to trust them that'll work smart. And authenticity, much like their Gen X cohorts, they really value authenticity in their leadership. So they want to work where people bring their full selves to work. So, things like diversity, equity, inclusion, transparency, and leadership are all very important to millennials. And I think you will definitely see that on your survey results too, and how you interpret some of the responses. So, I think a way that you can maybe utilize or leverage a millennial right now is invite them to co-create. They value being part of a process, giving them frequent, meaningful feedback, not just that annual review. Show how their work connects to a bigger picture. Be authentic. They've had marketing in their face since they were kids, and they can spot authenticity quite quickly, like their Gen X cohort. They feel valued, seen, and supported. When they feel valued, seen, and supported, they really do thrive. And they will definitely promote the mission. They definitely will bring you some fresh ideas, and they'll stay loyal to leaders who invest in them. So right now, I could see like where you might want to utilize them most in like cross-functional leadership projects, project-based work, anything that's around culture, people-focused roles, tech forward environments, change management, any kind of innovation initiatives that may be going on within your organization. And then let's talk about Gen Z in the 15 or so minutes that we have left. So they are our most recent additions to the workforce. They were born roughly between 1996 and 2000. I see 2010 and I see 2012, so I put 2012. Okay. This is the first generation that was truly digital from day one, right? They've really never known life without the internet because the internet, it really was beamed in or accessible in most people's homes by like 1995-ish. So they were born after a lot of them were born after 9/11. So they've always known school lockdown drills, and they came of age, really, a lot of them during a global pandemic. So where millennials were told the world was full of possibilities, Gen Z kind of grew up knowing that the world was volatile, but that they may have a voice or a point of view that could help shape it, right? So a few kind of depressing things to set the backdrop for the world that Gen Z was born into and kind of been raised and conditioned into. So, by the time they were born, people weren't spent no waking hours on the internet, and 30 years later, people spend the majority of their waking hours online, right? The average cost of a college degree at a lot of their births was only $13,000, and by the time they're 30, it's $34,000. And the annual drug overdoses at the time that they were born were 78,000 per year, and now they're reaching 30,000, and more than 112,000 Americans a year are overdosing. They are the most racially and ethnically diverse generation in American history. They care deeply about social justice, identity, and authenticity, not just as trends, but as non-negotiables. They're savvy, creative, and deeply practical. They watched millennials graduate into debt, burnout, and disillusionment, and they are pretty hell-bent on not repeating it. I don't know if you ever talked to a Gen Z person about all of that, but they are very real with their thoughts on all of that. The rise of mental health as a topic or being able to kind of break the stigma is something as a generation that I think we can give them a lot of credit for. but they've really leaned into talking about anxiety and therapy and burnout and things like that out loud. And then you have, some of their peer influencers, athletes, celebrities like, Simone Biles or Selena Gomez or people like that that have really publicly prioritized their mental health over performance. And obviously Gen Z has, kind of taken that to heart, right? But you have apps like Calm and Headspace and BetterHelp and TikTok therapists and Instagram therapists that have made mental health resources more normalized and way more accessible. And then, of course, probably the biggest disruption to their social development, peer development was probably the pandemic, right? A lot of them were still in their formative years, so they experienced things like loneliness and disruption and a lot of loss of those things. Like they didn't get to go to some of them go to graduation or prom, or they didn't get to see their friends on a regular basis. It was all on a screen. So they also saw adults kind of fall apart, institutions that struggled, mental health emerge as a necessity, not a luxury, and it taught them that life is fragile. So your time better matter, right? So there's also been this kind of backlash from Gen Z against hustle culture, which is kind of the millennial maybe ethos. Gen Z watched millennials kind of burn out in their quote unquote dream jobs and said, no, thank you. They don't believe in overworking for the sake of optics. So wellness culture, things like exercise, journaling, sleep tracking, saying no is seen as productive, not indulgent, which is a stark contrast, I think, from all all of our prior generations. So things like kind of that came out of that mindset were things like, I'm sure you guys heard about quiet quitting or bare minimum Mondays or mental health days aren't laziness. They're just what Gen Z may consider setting boundaries, right, between work and life. They also grew up with an exposure to comparison at all times because they were seeing, everything through the lens of social media, right? So they saw these quote unquote perfect lives, but they also saw horrific things like climate collapse and political dysfunction and tragedy and all that stuff all at once. So the level of emotional saturation, that they had to do makes filtering what's worth your energy kind of a survival tactic for them. So they deeply believe in the intentional usage of time. They see rest as a resistance, and they see sustainable productivity. So their mind shift compared to older generations. Boomers saw rest as lazy. Gen X maybe saw rest as reward. Millennials saw it as a goal they might reach someday. And Gen Z sees rest, wellness, and mental clarity as essential starting right now. It's not a future oriented thing. It's a in the moment thing, right? Social media for them also is an identity. Okay, so they were 10 years old and had Instagram accounts. They had TikTok. They had YouTube. They are not hobbies. That's how Gen Z is communicating, how they're learning, how they're expressing their identity. And then on top of all of that, there has been a lot of social justice movements in the last 15 years, right? We've had Black Lives Matter, we've had Me Too, we've had climate crises and climate activists. We've had March for Our Lives against gun violence. We've had LGBT rights and visibility. So they didn't read about change. A lot of them participated in it, and often they participated before they could even drive a car. So the most interesting thing is the relationship with their Gen X parents. So 58% of Gen Z kids said that one of their parents was a best friend of theirs. For Gen Z, uncertainty isn't a disruption, it's their environment. And in this world, they've learned to be fast, creative, cautious, and emotionally honest. So how they show up at work. They really value flexibility, mental health, and work-life boundaries. Like I've said, expect transparency and purpose from leadership, prefer digital communication that's both fast and visual, and a strong desire for quick growth and meaningful impact. They thrive with more autonomy and creative freedom, and they're loyal to authentic leaders, not institutions. Another survey discrepancy I see a lot, more so with millennials and Gen Z than any others, but in particular Gen Z. Any of those items that are around technology and communication, if it's viewed as inefficient, antiquated, ineffective, old, whatever, you will really start to see the demographic data really trend downwards in those two generations, particularly Gen Z, like I said, it's a millennial, where it's like, it's not just the relationship with their boss that matters or their paycheck. If they get too frustrated with the technology that's utilized, the communication, etc., they're also more likely to leave an organization that they feel is not staying up to date or current in those realms as well. So another thing to keep in mind with Gen Z, it's not just about the relationships with those that they're working with, but kind of the infrastructure that you're providing them, how they're working and communicating. A lot of them, though, are really entrepreneurial, and I think that's a interesting attribute as a generation. They have always kind of known life to include things like side hustles or having a digital content that they get paid from, or owning an Etsy shop and having jewelry that they sell, or they see freelance gigs. That have kind of sprung up because of things like social media. They also have learned by watching, but not watching like TV, like I did, like watching cable television like Nickelodeon and Disney Channel and stuff. They learned by watching things on YouTube or TikTok, or it was just portable learning, right? They value diversity, mental health, and boundaries. They don't see work as a badge of honor. They see it as a tool to support their life. So when we're communicating with Gen Zs as an individual and as an organization, transparency is super important. They can sniff out performative leadership in a matter of seconds. Keep it concise. Think about it. They basically have lived in a digital, communication world forever, where your average TikTok or Instagram is less than 60 seconds, right? It's very much like a headline grabbing culture. So long meetings, ineffective meetings, redundant meetings, that's going to be a hard pass for Gen Z. That's not going to be something they tolerate long term. Offering flexibility and choice to them, so let them own the how they get it done, or how it goes about, or how we get done, how we might go about getting things done when it's possible. Engage them visually and socially, right? So think of video, think of screenshots, think of quick demos, not long memos. Okay, quick demos, not long memos. Be real, because they do expect authenticity, so they won't follow someone they can't trust. So right now I can see them really thriving within the organization in roles that are project-based learning, where they have the opportunity to grow and experience new things. In roles or areas where they can express creative freedom, especially if it has to do with like tech or branding or innovation. Obviously, a lot of them are flocking to remote and hybrid roles, right? Because that offers a lot of flexibility. And any opportunity that they may have to advance quickly if they're performing well. Because I think that's been the biggest complaint that I've had from some of my clients, is that the expectation is that the growth is immediate, right? That they're automatically ready to be a director. It's like, well, we got a little bit of experience to cultivate there, but they will do well in things like social media and brand, being like the voice of your brand. Anything that's like people focused. So if it's around mental health or tech for good or social responsibility, those things are probably gonna resonate with them. And they're really into experimental environments. So like you see a lot of Gen Z and people that are employees that are really thriving in things like startups, or teams that are having to be really agile and ready to pivot and change. So I think the other thing that we're not yet prepared for, because we are living in it in real time, so we won't know the impact quite yet, is that AI is going to impact everybody at work. But I think Gen Z in particular, they're going to be probably more digitally native, just like Gen Alpha will be, because they will always have known kind of AI. But that's kind of a to be seen thing. Another thing that I think is really interesting with Gen Z is, and I hear this a lot from people that do a lot of hiring, like in selection, is that you're recruiting their parents, not just them. Like there's a lot of parental involvement in their career decisions, which has been interesting. But I think I heard a really good quote from a TikTok influencer that I follow a couple months ago, and they said that Gen Z doesn't want to climb the quote unquote broken ladder of the previous generations. They want to build something better. They're not afraid to challenge status quo, and they'll do it with Canva, ChatGPT, and TikTok strategy all before 10 a.m. So that's another thing too, ChatGPT, right? That's another thing that we didn't have access to. It's quickly shaping how people are, using it for school and work and everything else. So I'm going to skip this ad too because we're almost out of time, but it's a BetterHelp ad. It's all about, people needing help. Very cleverly done with the suit jacket. And then, like I said, we have limited data on Gen Alpha right now, but this is the predicted workplace kind of traits or trends that we may see. So expect for Gen Alpha everything to be hyper personalized, their benefits, their learning style, their communication. They will also rely heavily on voice, video, and visual storytelling more than anything ever before. So no more typing, no more written word. They're likely to blend virtual and in-person work seamlessly because it'll seem very much native to them, where we've kind of had to learn how to make it all work, right? They will prioritize mental health and life design over the quote-unquote traditional career tracks. They will definitely still value authenticity and micro communities over mass messaging. And they will expect to work along AI. They may not necessarily fear it. So what's shaping them? Obviously, a lot of them were raised early during a great period of disruption, like the pandemic, right? So they're kind of been conditioned with safety precautions, but also really digitally native because they had to learn digitally and virtually for so long. They were basically tech savvy or tech native from birth. A lot of them learned how to swipe before they could read. And of course, they're going to be influenced by things like AI, voice assistants, and short form video. And you got YouTube Kids, you got TikTok right now. A lot of them are going to be raised by millennials. So the millennial parenting, you're going to see its effect or its downstream impact on the Gen Alpha kids as they enter the workforce, right? So a lot of millennials have prioritize things like emotional intelligence, inclusivity. Oh my gosh, inclusivity. Sorry, and mental health. And we're expecting some highly personalized content and education. So like apps that know their name, their agent, their age, their preferences, and they're going to be exposed to global conversations. So they've always kind of known about climate change and gender identity and the ethics of digital interactions and social acceptability online, and they've known it from a very early age. So anyway, just last thoughts here. Leading across generations and creating the work environment really starts with understanding kind of where people are coming from, right? So everybody's been shaped kind of by the world they grew up in, but no one wants to be reduced to a stereotype. And all ages of people want the same core things from their organization, from their working relationships, and that's to feel valued, to do some sort of meaningful work, to be led with honesty, empathy, and trust. And the best leaders in organizations, they don't play into the label of a generation. They ask really good questions, they listen, and they adapt based on that feedback, right? Which is kind of what we're asking people to do with something like a best places survey, right? Is to really take that all that feedback into consideration and then make the appropriate changes, what you can do to kind of meet the needs. And I think that every generation hopefully leaves the workforce or the workplace better than they found it, right? Like we each kind of incrementally have made improvements to how we work and why we work and how it's designed. So, I think every generation should get their accolades for changing something for the better for the incoming or for the upcoming generations. So hopefully you guys thought this was fun. Sorry I didn't play all the video clips, but like I said, we were kind of tight on time. So any questions or anything for me or the survey or why generational experiences kind of matter with surveying? Do you see how all of that kind of feeds into how they may rate things, how each generation may interpret questions differently based on where they're kind of coming from and what their lens is going to be on how they view certain topics. Okay, thanks, Jessica. I'm really bad
Okay.
about reading chats during it. Sorry.
I thought that was great. I know we're right at time, so if anyone needs to drop, feel free to go ahead. But as we were going through this, especially at the end when you mentioned like across all generations, like folks want to do meaningful work. And I think, on our call, all of our health centers that are on, like we're doing such meaningful, important work. So I think that that's really, a characteristic that can be used in support of that workforce. I am curious if anyone has any ideas or suggestions, or Chase, if you have any recommendations about making sure that people feel and recognize the meaning of their meaningful work. Like some days and some positions are just a little bit more exposed to the impact than others. So maybe those positions that aren't as directly, in the spotlight of feeling the glow of the community impact, how we can help them really see how they're like an important cog within the machine that's making it happen.
Sure. No, I'd be interested to hear what your folks have to say too, because it is something that's easier said than done. I will admit that, right? It is, there are some roles that it's very hard sometimes for the person to feel the impact or for them to connect those dots. So honestly, a lot of it does go back to their manager and their leaders, right? If that person can't connect the dots, can we help them connect those dots, right? I think the biggest thing is to try to explain the why behind stuff, right? Like even if you can't really give, I don't know, what they're doing, their day-to-day contributions, a lot of, I don't know, weight or importance, maybe you can at least explain why their role or why they as a person are of value to you or the team or the organization. And I think we're kind of, as a manager, you have to listen to people and you also kind of customize or deploy the right tactics to kind of meet their needs and recognize what they need from you. And but I'd be interested to hear what you guys have used to explain that to people. um, might have some more practical advice, but no, okay. Well, I will say this though. Sometimes when I work with leaders, like in coaching and stuff like that, and they'll say things like, I just don't have a very motivated team, or I can't really seem to get them to do more than the acceptable, kind of bare minimum, but doing their job right, but maybe not going the extra mile. Sometimes I'm just like, well, sometimes we just have to accept people for who they are too, right? Are they dependable? Are they actually doing their job? Do they not cause a lot of issues within the team? Or are they, not a lot of drama, as I like to say? Sometimes people just want to be worker bees, right? And that's fine too. We just kind of have to listen to what they need from us and make sure that we don't make assumptions about what they may need from us, right? So that's why a lot of check-ins and asking for feedback on an individual level is so important to make sure you're meeting their needs. And people throughout their life cycle within the organization, their needs and their priorities will shift, right? So as a young person, you're going to value something completely different than when you're an older person, just because that's life, right? So I think there is some perspective that kind of happens as we mature, right? As people, I think it's a lot clearer, hopefully, for a 50-year-old to see their impact and see how to connect those dots than it is the 22-year-old right out of college, right? But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's just as many 50-year-olds that sometimes don't see the point of anything as there are 22-year-olds. I don't know. But I have noticed, I guess, anecdotally, that the more mature the employee, sometimes the easier it is for them to see all of that and kind of feel it or recognize it without necessarily having to explain it to them. But again, whatever experience you guys have had, that'd be great. If you want to throw it in the chat or the group.
I made two other notes, Chase, too. I love a
Okay.
generations at work talk. So I'd love to hear from you or the team. I think it's interesting thinking of our baby boomers and, like valuing and respecting their experience and using them in mentorship roles. I've heard
Hmm.
some great examples of especially providers as they're maybe nearing retirement or maybe, wanting to step into like a part-time role. If anyone's found success in a way to like use that experience and that talent in a way to like help empower other maybe the younger generation within your workforce.
I'm trying actually to give some feedback. I'm trying to think. So the only thing that I can think of is we had a lot of acquisitions where we went in and hired groups of people. So most of those had set up like as office managers. So we had this office manager that was very strong. She was a great people person, but she came in telling us that she was going to retire, that through this transition, it was time. She was a baby boomer, she's like, I've been, preparing for all this time. So we ended up utilizing her to kind of be like a liaison between us and them to help any issues or concerns or frustrations that they had to bring it back to us. And she did it in a very leadership
Mhm.
way because of her experience. So we got to use her in that role for about, I think it was about 8 months. I think she agreed to 6, and then we talked her into doing it just a couple more months to do the transition. But then after it was said and done, she was so valuable and had so much insight that we were able to place her into another role that she could work from home. And she actually is working in our billing department. I know that sounds kind of off, but she, as the office manager, she dealt a lot with billing issues. But it was very tactful, and it was a great experience for her and the staff to have somebody with such longevity
Mhm.
to take to go about things, how to handle things or make things better. So we were able to tap into her skill set, and she still works remotely today.
That's great. I'm glad that was successful for you. I will say doing succession planning and career pathing with clients, sometimes that's a very creative solution. I always tell people, like I kind of mentioned it before, like, we don't have enough. We have baby boomers that are living really healthy, long lives, right? Which is great, but they're not vacating some of those seats fast enough, right, to move people up and develop them, right? So some of the like compromise or creative solutions have been to like bring them on as independent contractors and have them like as a special projects person or whatever that helps with the transition, and kind of passing on that institutional knowledge throughout a transitional period before they actually retire. But sometimes that kind of throws them a bone to make them want to make the leap into this new role, but also still respecting them and appreciating them. And then they're more willing to say, yes, I'd love to stay on and help so and so get ready in their role. And then they've got a little income coming in too, because maybe they're picking up some hours as a special projects person or whatever. But not every organization obviously can do that, right? Like sometimes it's the financial constraint that prevents them from doing that. But that's a great solution that you guys found, and I hope that team is very appreciative that person was able to do that and help them out, because that is the biggest thing. I think there's this institutional knowledge gap that sometimes happens in organizations with people that have been there a long time. Doesn't matter if they're boomers or not; they've been there for a long time. There's a lot of unspoken stuff that just never gets documented. And I think that's when somebody is transitioning like that, besides just, everything that they know, passing on that kind of tribal knowledge to their successors or the other people that are going to stay is really important. Because it's often stuff that's not documented in SOP that is still valuable for people to learn and know about to be successful.
Kim, thanks for sharing that. That was an awesome example of how we can use our boomers and kind of help mentor and welcome the next generation at the same time while respecting everything that they bring to the workplace. And so the other end of our generations, I wanted to ask a question about Gen Zs. So I know our Gen Zs, they love to, or they really respect boundaries, and they're really about protecting their peace, especially in the workplace. And, you know, I'm thinking about some of the conversations I've had with my younger brother, who's a Gen Z, and about his workplace culture. And he can be, you know, some things that I think that other generations saw as opportunities, like maybe joining a committee or working on a special project, there can be a reluctance because they don't want their plate to become overwhelmed. You know, they kind of have those boundaries. So I guess my question is, has anyone found a strategy or a successful practice on like how you're able to tee up like a committee, a special project, an opportunity to maybe grow in their career at the same time where they may be a little bit more reluctant to get involved because they want to protect their peace and their boundaries and making sure they don't become overwhelmed? I think that's a tough one.
We have what we call VAC, so it's the voice of the Employee Advisory Council. And so a lot of the it's kind of been like pulling teeth, nails, whatever, to get folks on that council, and then to actually get feedback from the staff. So it's a great idea, right, to have those types of meetings, but we've also having those meetings has allowed the folks, because again, a majority, I would say, looking at our age ranges on our employees now, it has done this, right?
Oh,
So we have a lot of the younger folks in the workforce. I would say 20 to 30, 22 to 30 years probably is a majority of our workforce now. Front desk, like nurses and frontline staff, I guess. Um, but that's kind of how we wanted to try to make sure that we kept them engaged, but didn't make it to where it was more time on them, like say outside of their regular work schedule. So we just kept it during lunch. We pay them, that, you know, as far as through the lunch and things like that. So that's kind of how we've tried to make sure that they stay engaged, but then it's also to help us figure out things that the rest of their staff want in their clinics too.
sure.
So
That's a great tactic, and I completely am an advocate for like staff-led initiatives like that, or special teams that work on things like culture or values or whatever it may be. So I applaud you for doing that, and I sometimes see that happen in practice as well, where people are reluctant to do it. Doesn't matter that they're Gen Z or not; they just think like, "Oh, this is one more thing I've got to do." So I always try to like recommend people as much as you can sell it as a leadership team to them by inviting them to participate. That this is really like uh low effort, high impact, right? Like that's what we're trying to offer you is be visible, have a really, you know, impactful presence, or, you know, whatever meaningful impact on the workplace. But we're really not asking you to do anything extra, which I think is great that you're doing it during lunch. You're paying them. If you could feed them during that lunch, I'm sure they'd really be appreciative too, right? Food always is a great motivator, no matter what generation anybody belongs to. But I was going to say, Ashley, I have noticed that too. But another anecdotal thing that I've noticed with Gen Z in particular, with things like, you know, becoming, joining something extra, committee or otherwise, they are very comfortable with asking you for more money to do that thing than any other generation, and trying to kind of explain how things like that expose us to opportunities to make us earn more money, but to actually be compensated for it an individual project basis is a little unrealistic. You know, most organizations can't do that. So it's been a big shift in expectations around pay as well versus effort, right? With prior generations, I think, probably sacrificing a lot of their own personal time, um, and being not maybe satisfied, but just that's part of the job, right? It's part of the paycheck. You got to go extra, got to go above and beyond. Gen Z is very much like it's transactional, right? You give me this, I give you that. And that's cool. That's fine. But I think it's been a big shift for a lot of us that have never just were conditioned that way. That wasn't our expectation entering the workforce. So it's been a little shocking, but also kind of funny because I think Gen Z is wonderfully honest. And when they tell you no, they mean it. Like you ask them their opinion, they tell you something. Okay, great, thank you. I think a lot of the other generations tend to try to people please and kind of, make it sound as best as they can and kind of hide their true feelings around stuff. Gen Z doesn't care. They will tell you. And I like that. It's kind of fun. But I think you're doing a wonderful opportunity. You're giving them a wonderful opportunity to do it. And I think you would be more criticized for not offering that opportunity to them than are that you offered it and they didn't take it than if you didn't have that opportunity at all. You know what I mean? Like it's there for you to utilize, but if you didn't have it at all, I think that's be the bigger criticism. They might be able to lob at you, but food is the biggest motivator. So feed those people during those meetings, and you'll all of a sudden have all these people that want to volunteer for it. Joking, but not really. Just like when when you have college kids, if you had pizza at the meeting, they'd come. You know what I mean? Anyway. Well, thank you all. I know we're going a little bit long today, but I really did try to condense it. It's such a big topic. But hopefully this is fun, and maybe you guys can take it back to your requisite groups and maybe talk about it as a, as a strategy, right, to engage people or have your leaders think about some things maybe they haven't thought about before as they're trying to kind of appeal to the different demographics that they may be leading or managing or working with. So I guess I'll see you guys at the end of July.
Thank you so much, Chase. This was great.
Yeah.
Like I said, I always love a generational conversation, and I think it's great to just have these things fresh in our mind as we're crafting different strategies to recruit and retain our folks. So this was really helpful. I appreciate you, and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Again, yep. And team, I mean, as we're kind of like turning the page with the new fiscal year, we really count on you guys to let us know what's going on, what's relevant. So we're looking for new session topics, and if we like to keep learning collaborative structure, if we want to go back to more of like a peer conversation group, or maybe more toolkits and documents we could create to help you also, please just keep us informed of how we could best serve you guys. And stay cool. My goodness.
Yeah.
In this heat.
All right. Stay hydrated.
Thanks, y'all.
All right.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you all.